Morning and afternoon on wherever you're joining us today. We are in Delmo's company. My name's Stella and I'm here hosting this webinar today with my colleague in education, a friend from education days, Cath Blayney, who is ex-Headteacher and now has transitioned into working as an executive coach and qualified thinking partner. It's a mouthful, isn't it? Cass joins us this morning as we begin or continue our series on inclusive leadership, a series that I'm really, really passionate about, having spent a number of years, close to, I don't look it, I know, close to sort of would be 20 years, 16, 17 years in education, teaching, having moved away and stepped away from education, just really seeing the value of inclusive leadership in that space and in the work that I did. How inclusive leadership and leading inclusively what does ensure then that staff and students, as well as kind of wider stakeholders, feel engaged and part of the process when it comes to education and how we can improve the current status quo of education for the young people in our care, as well as the staff who work with them. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by Cath Blayney. I currently then have moved out of education into consulting with Delmo's company. And as Prachi explained, we are passionate about ED&I and ensuring that we are able to assist organisations, private and public, as well as education settings to grow through inclusion. So without further ado, welcome, Cath. How are you?
Thank you. I'm very well, thank you. Enjoying the sunshine.
You and me both. You and me both. It's been a glorious weekend of sun. I hope it continues and it's not fleeting. So yeah, Cath, go ahead and perhaps just, I don't know, tell us a little bit about yourself. In fact, let's go for some warm-up questions. Cheesy, I know, but let's go for some warm-up questions so our audience kind of get a little flavour about you, who you are, and kind of what you do currently. I mentioned earlier that you were a former head teacher and now have moved into inclusive leadership coaching. So it's an area that we are kind of really passionate about and we kind of overlap in experience and expertise. So let's just do a bit of a warm up really quickly and then get into the nooks and crannies of who you are, what you do, and let's dive into this conversation. So first of all, if I were to say, I don't know, favourite song or saying?
I think it's going to have to be a Maya Angelou quote. So it's the one where do your best until you know better, and when you know better, do better. And I try and live by that as much as I can because we don't know everything. But once we know, let's take some action.
Absolutely. I love that one. I really, really love that one. Do the best you can. I think do the best you can so you know better. And when you know better, do better, right?
Yeah, that's the one. I don't know if I've said it word for word, but it is that one. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that one. I think ultimately that's what we're trying to do, isn't it? It's ensuring that we are doing the very best we can, especially within the work that we do, and encouraging people to sort of do better with the knowledge bank and information that we're able to impart to them. Love that. What makes you smile other than a sunny day like today, Cath?
Sandy beach. Can't beat it. Nice sandy beach, some sunshine and some water. Yeah.
I'll take it. Don't love the sand part. Sand braids don't quite go, but the sun part I will take, not the sand. And Cath, if I were to ask then, what are your professional whys? So why are you in this space? What's your why?
Yeah, I think my why is all about inclusion and belonging. I think that my experiences over time have led me to a place where I really see the value of being inclusive and having a sense of belonging. And we hear lots of different ideas about what inclusion is, what belonging is. And I think my why is to help inspire and educate people to be more inclusive so that leaders and people can feel like they have a contribution to make, that they feel safe to be themselves and to bring their whole selves to whichever role they're doing, whether it's in schools, outside of schools, other organisations, and even things like friendships, families. We want to be able to bring our full selves and to help others to do the same.
Absolutely. I think I like what you talk about there in terms of kind of extending out to beyond education. It's it's that life's work, isn't it? It's that ability to take these conversations around inclusion into not just professional careers, but into how we move in the world as well, how we challenge, um, and we're not just kind of inactive bystanders to things that are going on in the world. So it's creating those kind of seamless transitions from how we make sure that people feel included within the workplace, but also then challenge those spaces and make people feel included outside of work and in our everyday walk. Like it. So tell me about your school experience. I know that we both spent extensive periods of time working in education as teachers, and gradually moved through as leaders ourselves. And of course, you were a head teacher. But before we get to your role as a head teacher and talk about how you perhaps worked within that space to be inclusive and brought your staff along on that inclusive leadership journey, tell us about your school experience. What was school like for you?
I had a really mixed school experience. I think my story is similar in lots of ways to others. I mean, I think my primary school experience wasn't a hugely positive one in lots of ways, but I learned a lot. And I think in secondary school, I had a positive experience. And I think the biggest part of that was the friends that I made. Still friends with lots of them today, and had that sense of belonging in secondary school that I maybe didn't get in primary school. And then when I came out of secondary education, I went into university, I studied psychology. I've always been really curious about learning and how the mind works. And I think that's what drew me into education as a profession. I got very curious about child psychology and, how different people learn in different ways. And I really wanted to bring that into my work and what I did. And so, that's how my journey kind of fed into education. I did a master's in special and inclusive education. And then, the rest is history. Started working in a primary school in London and then went through to headship.
And what was that like? Speak about working in a primary school setting then. So I worked in a secondary and sixth form. You worked in primary, two completely different beasts in the best of ways, of course. What was that like for you, and how were you able to kind of, as you described them, bring your whole self and bring that training and knowledge of the benefits of inclusion into that space, working in primary?
I think for me, it was having the experience to try and get to know people. And that's something that I hold really close to me. So getting to know the children, getting to know the staff, to try and bring them on a journey with you. I think it's challenging, working in schools. There's so many demands on schools, on leaders, on staff members, in terms of the time and the workload and the kind of the well-being balance that we all try to strike. But I think primarily it's about us putting people first and using that as our core and then going from there.
Absolutely. And I think you make a really interesting point there about people first. And I think you may agree with me here. I think what's missing from the education system currently, then, amongst various other things that may be problematic, alongside the great things that are happening, is that sense of people first. It's ensuring that we are, as leaders, then prioritising the teams that we're leading, and we're looking then to things like well-being and mental health, special education needs, etc. So having those things at front and centre as we have conversations about how best to lead our teams. What would you say?
Yeah, I think you're right, because I think there's so many policies and procedures that we implement in schools and in other workplaces as well. But each of those policies, each of those practices has an impact on a person. And if we can look at it from that perspective and design them from that perspective, then we can really make a difference in terms of how people engage with it, how we connect with people, and the success of whatever goal or vision you want to achieve. And so I think having people first and thinking about what people's experiences are and listening to those experiences, being curious, asking questions about it, so that you can really learn what's going well, so that you can change it and not being, held by policies and the words of an organisation, and actually by the feelings and the people that are in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also one thing that I remember from my school days is asking leaders to kind of remember what it was like when they themselves perhaps were the class teachers, and so once them entered to leadership and they are bringing all of these, and as you're describing, new policies and procedures, are they doing those workplace assessments that ensure that staff can cope and keep the pace, and their well-being then is front and centre when these new initiatives are coming in. And I certainly remember that was one thing that was often lacking, was leaders getting into leadership. Really aspirational, that's great, but do you remember what it's like in the classroom and the impact, or policy after policy and new initiative after new initiative had on staff? So let's move on very slightly then. So you spent time as a head teacher. How long were you a head teacher for, and how did that sort of inform your move into your current space now, working with leaders?
Yeah, I was head teacher for a couple of years, and I think for me, the reason why I do the work that I do now is because at the start of that headship journey, it was quite overwhelming. And as a leader, I felt like I had all of these things that I had to do. And, there's a lot of firefighting to do as a senior leader in schools. And what I was missing at the start of the journey, which I now know more about and was able to kind of progress through my headship journey, was being values led and to really know who I am and to learn about what I want to bring and what I want to achieve, because it really helped in across the board. So when I'm making decisions, I would initially ask other people for lots of ideas, or I would refer to 5 policies to try and help me make that decision. And I think when you lead with your values, you can really be more effective in those decisions, and you trust yourself more to make decisions that are the right decisions and in line with the vision and the values of the school. And I think that's something that I went on a real journey on with when I started headship. And part of the reason why I do what I do now is to try and share that journey with other people, so that they can not take as much time as I did to learn that, and actually really benefit from understanding themselves and knowing what they want to achieve, being really grounded in their values and using them to build connection with people, to achieve the goals that they want in the school, and to really help find that balance, because you can then prioritize what are the important things. When your plate is full, that's a really important skill to have, to be able to say, right, these are the things that are going to have the most impact on what I'm doing. These are the most important things that are aligned with the values of both myself and the school. And so that's where I'm going to put my time and energy. And we know that, the rest of it has to get done, but we then give it the time that it deserves, rather than kind of trying to spread ourselves so thinly that we don't ever manage to do anything as well as we want to do.
Amazing answer. Absolutely. I think you're talking there about fostering genuine, authentic leadership, aren't you? It's not doing what the policy and procedure says, but it's actually kind of it's bringing out that human side detail. It's a genuine curiosity about your teams, what works well, and getting the best out of it by leading with those values that they can hold you to and hold you accountable on. And also it allows staff to genuinely feel safe, would you say, in your company, knowing that they know what the answer is going to be, they know how academic you or any leader is going to respond, and therefore, I guess, productivity and sort of that sense of belonging and being part of the team is amplified, would you say?
Yeah, and if staff know your values, I think that's the first step. I think we all hold values. We might be aware of exactly what they are. We might not yet have done that work, but we do all hold values. And it's whether your staff know what they are. Because I think when you have an organisation where people know the values, not just of the school, but of individual people, there's the opportunity to find common ground, and there's the opportunity for you to say, we might not be completely aligned in our values, but actually here's what we've got in common, and we are working towards this shared goal. And I'm happy to come on that journey with you because I can see the value in what you're trying to bring and what you're trying to do in the organisation.
Absolutely. And I think the leaders that do that the best are the leaders that kind of run the most efficient and most welcoming school environments, and those that sense of inclusion kind of radiates not just within the staff body, but radiates as a parent or carer entering section, for example. You go in and you kind of get that sense of who is this person, what are their values, do they align with what we're doing, and even as a parent or carer, actually not getting the response you want from a school leader, you're wholly convinced that their values align with and are consistent, even if they're not necessarily, it's not the yes answer that you might want often. Yeah. So I remember that being a key thing, and using that then as a way of kind of encouraging more wider inclusion. So let's stick with the theme of inclusion then and kind of leading authentically. Before this event, we had sent out a poll on LinkedIn. We asked people to sort of rank and talk about which leadership traits were sort of the most important to them. And there was three that the most votes. They were fairness, belonging, and empathy. And so I think of all of those are really, really important, of course. But I think empathy is one that it sounds like we're kind of we can pick up and just kind of talk about some more then. So I think what you've mentioned is the idea then, what we know, that empathetic leaders are the ones that are able to, as you say, lead into members of staff, be inquisitive, want to know more, and knowing more, they are allowing those individuals to show up as their whole selves and outperform in school settings. So talk to me a little bit then about the traits you would see to be most important when it comes to being an inclusive leader. It may well be fairness, belonging, and empathy, but are there any others?
I think underpinning each of those is the ability for leaders to listen. And we do a lot of work throughout our careers, even as children in school, about how to listen. But what I've learned on my journey is the difference between listening to respond and listening to ignite the thinking in others. And as a coach, I do lots of work around the thinking environment, which is an approach designed by Nancy Klein. And she makes that distinction. In a world where we have lots of interruptions, we interrupt ourselves, the media interrupts us, and we don't have the opportunity to think for ourselves as much as we should and as much as we'll have an impact. And so I think when we learn to listen to ignite someone else's thinking, rather than waiting for that space for us to say our ideas or give our advice or share our experience, I think when we shift to a space where we're really listening to the person and their experience, it really helps develop deeper thinking. And when you are in that environment as a receiver, if you're being allowed the space to think safely with no judgment, then you can really feel safe that it's okay to disagree. It's okay to have new ideas that maybe haven't been thought of before. And all of those things create the idea of things being fair because people get equal opportunities to talk, to think and to be together. It helps with the sense of belonging because people feel valued and listened to. And empathy is all part of that as well. They feel that connection within teams. You can't be a leader if you're not connected. And I think we need to make sure we know our team as people and their personalities and the bits that make them up and not just what their professional role is or what their appraisals say about them and what their goals are. We need to see them as whole people and really value that and listen to them and help them to think for themselves and be creative and feel safe.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. So I guess the question then would be, or the follow-up to that would be, inclusive leaders and ones that do that work really, really well are few and far between often. And usually the issue then is blind spots. It's how do we get individuals or leaders within education then to see those things as priorities as opposed to the additional pressures of results, of COVID catch-up, of absenteeism, so on and so forth, of budget crunches and so on and so on. What and how can we ensure that leaders are cognizant of those things, the things that are paramount and will essentially have a really positive impact and all the other things that are happening? So how do we get leaders to consider their blind spots in that space and kind of move things forward and drive change?
Yeah, it's a hard question because when it's a blind spot, we aren't aware of it. And I think that we need to build that awareness through things like this to show leaders that actually it starts with them and it's not necessarily what they do, it's who they are, and that it's okay to take care of yourself and to understand who you are because that will help your leadership. And I think that there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect between those two things, that leaders aren't viewing themselves as the priority, that they need to take care of everybody else and do all of the things that are linked to their role, but actually putting time into yourself as a leader in your own leadership development, understanding what makes you you and how you've got to this point, what your experiences are, and then using that to have conversations with other people about their own experiences and being open to that. Being open as a leader is so important if you're going to figure out what those blind spots are, because you need to be someone that people can come to and engage in a dialogue that might not be comfortable, it might be a challenge, but actually you're open to really listening to them and hearing their point of view. Because otherwise you get into a situation where people don't have those conversations with you, and then you never end up realizing what those blind spots are. So I think it's all about opening up the conversations. We don't know everything, just being comfortable with being a bit vulnerable and saying, I don't know. And sometimes as leaders, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be perfect and to always have the answers and to know exactly what to say and exactly what to do. But really, the power is really in that vulnerability and saying, like, I don't know, this is what I'm working on, and knowing that we're all working on something and we all want to do better. And just having that openness, because it will help build trust with the people that you're working with, that you do want to kind of see the world through different lenses and be able to see the values, celebrate the differences in the group, and really acknowledge people's different shared experiences, both within your organisation and outside of it as well.
Absolutely. I often think it's one of those traits that we drum into the students in our care, but we never necessarily always take on board ourselves, right? So we ask them to be courageous, do this and third, but we often as leaders then we're not necessarily investing, as you said, into our own leadership, into taking the time to do that listening, speaking last, etc. I think once we know what we need to do and how we go about it, and when we apply those things, you start to get into that space where these things become habitual. One of the things that we often talk about here at IDC is that habit forming and habit changes, and in looking out for those traits that people could commit to, and they become habitual. So if it is indeed empathy, and that underpins everything we do, our awareness of the world and our place within it and our teams and so on, then it's how we make those things habits and how we kind of ensure that those habits are practiced time and time again, and they make their way into become or woven into the fabric of the organisation, or in this case, woven into the fabric of schools. So yeah, really interesting to come here and take all that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with habits. It's one of the things that I feel really passionate about, that it's not about kind of one-off 360 surveys that you take. It's about the action that you learn from things and you kind of do better. And I think in terms of habits, having a really reflective practice on what's going well, what maybe hasn't gone so well, and things that you want to do differently. One of the things that I talk to leaders a lot about is how they manage their time. Leaders generally have a full schedule, a full calendar each week, each month of meetings and projects that they need to do. And my question is always, where's the time for you? Where's the time to actually reflect and to think for yourself, rather than having all of these things that kind of are telling you what to do and you're doing all the things? But it's about being really intentional with that time. So as a leader, reflecting on how you spend your time, because you're a role model for your staff and your team about how they spend their time. So if your calendar is full of meetings, then theirs probably is too. And that sends a message. So where are you building time for self-care, for, leaving early and having a work-life balance? Where are you having time to just think about a project rather than do it? One of the coaches that I work with is all about scheduling time. And I remember talking to her about the project, and I was like, I need to do this in this time. And I thought I was scheduling my time really well. And actually what she said was, you're not scheduling tasks, you're scheduling projects. So it's about thinking about what those projects are and what the smallest steps are, because we say I want to finish writing this school development plan, but actually there are so many steps that are part of that you need to take care of first. And part of that is reflecting and thinking. And often we don't give ourselves time to reflect and to think about all of those things, and trying to build in habits of kind of weekly reflection time, building into weekly meetings or your staff meetings an opportunity for feedback and reflection, rather than, the list of things that we have to do and kind of ticking all the boxes of the tasks that we've got coming up. Where do you find those opportunities? Where do you form those habits of creating time to think, where people can give you that feedback, where you can create that sense of empathy? Because if you're always going along the to-do list, then there isn't that opportunity for connection with other people. It's more about the kind of admin side of it. So striking a balance and really carving that time out intentionally to think and to develop those connections with other people.
Absolutely. And that very much sounds like the setting that I left. You in education, then you are constantly in meetings. It's constantly ticking off lists. You're working towards a tight schedule. Reports need to be in, development plans needs to be in and so on and so forth. But you're absolutely right. It's, are we making time for feedback? Are we listening to our teams? Are we able to kind of gauge what's important to them and what's working? And if it's not working, how do we change those systems and processes to ensure that the voices of the teams, of staff members then, are being heard and are influencing how we create those inclusive environments within schools? Or are we, like I've often experienced, just going through methodically all the way through and get to July, and it's time to sort of end the year and rinse repeat September, and we've learnt nothing. We've not been able at all to pick up on any of the traits or the feedback from staff and allow that to inform best practice. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Time to reflect. It's almost like the way you would build in time to go to the gym, for example, or time for self-care. It's paramount to that, isn't it? It's just as important. Yeah.
It is, yeah. And you make a really good point about meetings, because one of the important parts of my work is helping schools and helping organisations to run really effective meetings. Ones where I think I saw a stat that said 30% of the people do 90% of the talking. And so we've all experienced at some point a meeting where someone dominates the conversation, there's lots of interruptions. And what I do when I work with teams is I bring the thinking environment in, which encourages people to have equal turns in speaking. And it really, there's a promise to not interrupt, which lots of teams find really difficult at first, because we're really used to being in situations where we have to say our idea or we have to respond to someone else's idea, when actually it's okay to sit back and digest it, and to not say that you agree or disagree with someone else's thinking, but actually just focus on your own thinking and share that. And I did a team day a couple of weeks ago where we looked at the school development plan, and as a team, they spoke really strategically about what they wanted to achieve, what their vision and their values were. And they went from this kind of multiple page document that went into like 7 or 8 different areas in lots of detail to a really concise school development plan where everyone had an input. They understood the reasons why the intentions were as they were. They were accountable for their part in it. And that was all based on changing the way their team days work so that everybody could share their ideas. There was some new thinking that happened. And the people that maybe don't often get a chance to talk actually had a space to speak at ease. And, you know, that's what I love about the thinking environment, that you take it in equal turns, that everyone listens to try and ignite your thinking rather than to respond to what you've said or to give you advice, etc. And I think it's one of the easiest and the most challenging ways to improve our sense of belonging. It's easy because once you've done it, it feels easy, but actually implementing the changes is so different to how we work now that it can feel really hard at the start. And I think even just taking an approach of, in our meetings, our agenda is sort of questions rather than items to kind of tick off. If you can't phrase it as a question, you don't need to put it in a meeting, because you don't need other people's ideas. You can just pop it in an email and it's information sharing, isn't it? But really spending that meeting time intentionally gathering ideas and feedback to kind of land on the best solution or the next goal is a really powerful way of helping that sense of belonging and creating those habits on a weekly or however often you have your meeting.
You know, I really like that idea, really like that. And I think one thing that comes across then is that when people are able to engage in that way, not only does it sound very basic, very fundamental, you get the best results, don't you? Everyone feels that their voice has been heard and you are getting answers to questions then and there. You get the strategy being developed and devised collectively, and you don't then need that kind of iteration after iteration. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that kind of segues straight into the next point I was going to talk about, which is how that impacts then on understanding of staff and the pressures then on them. Because if you can run an effective meeting in the way that you've just described, then actually the well-being of staff then would skyrocket. So I know recently there was the publication of the Teachers' Wellbeing Index, which pointed to 55% of teaching staff being or feeling completely overwhelmed. They'll see that their well-being was at rock bottom, being completely overwhelmed with some of the demands on their time, demands on on their resources and so on and so forth, and therefore it's having a negative impact on their well-being. So I think just kind of looking at those figures, 55% of teachers considering that their organisation or their school culture is having a negative impact, see absolutely the benefits then of leading in that way, in that collaboration process, and the ideas, kind of dynamic ideas that come across or happen in that space. So yeah, no, I completely agree with you. Have you read that report?
I've heard the headlines, and I think the first thing I thought was, this is why we're losing so many teachers. This is why so many people are leaving the profession, because we haven't got that balance. And we're in schools for a very shared purpose. Generally, we all want the best for the children, our doors, and the communities that we serve. And I think that with those intentions, you want to keep hold of those people, because that's going to have the most impact. But you also have to be quite radical sometimes and creative in how you strip back the demands outside of that, so that you can really focus on what's going to have the most impact.
Yeah, focus on people, essentially. No, absolutely. I think if you had seen our first webinar in this series, on the education series, we were talking about just that, talking about the hemorrhaging of staff, the fact that the Department of Education, again, last year failed on their recruitment targets. So we're not recruiting enough teachers, we're not being able to maintain them and have them stay. And then we're wondering what's going on with the UK education system. But as you say, it's do we and how do we strip back on what's essential, and conversations and the priorities. And I think inclusive leadership then is definitely one of them. And it's not just inclusive leadership then with high-level stakeholders, but it's inclusive leadership and how we lead from the top, but the impact it has right through the schools. How do we welcome in, as I say, parents and carers, staff from every sort of level of the school's leadership, teaching staff, support staff, and so on and so forth, bringing everyone together for that common good.
Yeah, and carving out time to do exactly that, because those conversations, at the school gates or in the staff room might not feel like a good use of your time. You might be thinking about your to-do list that you've got to do that day, but actually it's those conversations that are going to help build that connection. And with the demands that we have, we can't completely eliminate it, but it's about taking small steps in getting the balance better, rather than, we're never going to fully take away the workload in schools, because some of it is there really intentionally to do the best for the children. And so it's about figuring out for your school, what is that and what is going to have the most impact. And that will look different in different schools and organisations. What will work for one won't work for another. And so as a leader, we need to be gathering feedback. We need to be thinking creatively about what our school and what our context needs, because it's very easy to get swept away with new initiatives and different ideas from outside of our communities and our schools. But it's about really getting to know the people within the community and what they need, and how you can go about creating a bit more balance for them. It doesn't happen overnight, but just taking small steps can make transformational impact later on.
So one of the things that I heard when I spoke to a current serving teacher then was, when I asked about what's happening within your space, and I guess this idea of new initiatives and how that's having an impact on wellbeing, we continue on that line of thought, is how convinced she was about the negative impact of new initiatives and initiatives that people or leaders are seeing happening and working really well in other schools that are being brought into, let's say, her school. And so I think what she was describing there was the fact that we need to stop with the initiatives. We need to stop, pause, and look at what's working currently and what's not working. We need to kind of get rid of and think about what will work within our setting versus what a leader has seen happening in another setting that is trying to implement. And it's that kind of inability for some leaders then to see that and kind of narrow in on things that are really important that cause the stagnation. In response to that conversation, I did ask, why doesn't no one say anything? Who and how are you all in your teams communicating these things to leaders? And I think the kind of feedback or the comeback to that was, it doesn't feel safe to do so. If we complain, it feels as if we are saying we don't want to do the best for the students, but it's high time we start to look more introspectively and start to think about, what about the staff? If the staff don't turn up to school, so of course the students don't turn up, there is no school. If the staff don't turn up and staff cannot turn up to school, fully whole and well, then it just doesn't work, does it? So, but that her reservations were around, how do I say and not be looked at as someone who is lazy or not wanting to do the best for the students. It's that sense that if the students aren't involved, or if it's not the best for the students, if you're not going above and beyond, just say calendars aren't really fun, you're not attending every meeting, you're not contributing, then you're not doing the best for the students. So how, in your opinion then, can we begin to create those psychologically safe spaces where staff do feel that they can contribute in a meaningful way without fear of they are just not doing or pulling their weight, essentially? What do you say?
For me, it's about defining what you consider well-being to be, because I think often in leadership, we consider well-being as, taking time, doing a PPA at home, or having a nice fruit bowl, or, coming in late one morning, leaving early, not having any marking one night. But actually, and all of those things can help in well-being. But as an inclusive leader, you have to delve much deeper than that, because underneath all of that workload and all the stress that comes with it are a list of rules and expectations and systems that either have been created institutionally or you have created as a leader. And so an example of that is, if people have a huge workload in terms of their report, what are they viewing as good enough? And do they feel the need for it to be perfect? And perfectionism is something that I come across a lot with leaders, that things have to be just right. They don't want to put things out that might get criticised, or they're worried about how it's going to land. And so they spend a disproportionate amount of time on these tasks because they're afraid of getting it wrong. And we create that as inclusive leaders. And what we need to do is we need to talk about the good enough and try and dismantle that idea of perfectionism, thinking about what the purpose of it is. If it's a school report, what is the purpose of it? You want to communicate what the student's done well. You want to communicate what they need to achieve and how they're going to do that. And if you have managed to do all of those things, stop and move on to the next one. And I think when it comes to things like well-being, we have to delve deeper into the meaning of it, because if we don't, we are opening ourselves up to be non-inclusive, and we're opening ourselves up and our staff up to being affected by the expectations of others. Systems, we know disproportionately that perfectionism affects women and people from racialized groups. And I think that knowing that and understanding that sometimes it's the system that's telling us that we need to be better and do more and have it perfect and we can't make mistakes, we can dismantle that as inclusive leaders in our context by having those conversations and explaining what we view the task to actually look like. When we give out tasks like reports or its assessment, what does it actually look like, and how long do you expect people to be spending on these tasks? And when you know that and you have a really clear boundary, you can then sit in the, okay, you've done enough, and now you have to wait for feedback from your staff. Did it work? Did they still spend that much time? And it's not about then saying, I'll have half a day back. It's about, okay, how do we make sure that next time we do that, it doesn't take as much time and we're being more effective? Do we need to change the procedure that we use, the process, the template, in order to create a system that is still as useful but doesn't weigh down on our staff as much as the current one?
Absolutely. I've picked up a couple of things that really resonate for me from my time in education. I remember thinking and telling my teams at times that 80% was good enough. And if it's taking you X amount of time to mark a set of class books, then actually we're doing it the wrong way. And as a result of that, we were able to just produce a pro forma, a template that meant that we could go ahead and tick and give a one-sentence response, an area for what went well, and an EBI, even best riff, and so on and so forth. So really thinking about how much time we are throwing into that work. And as you made a good point around who are the individuals that are working within this remit, those individuals who are working to that perfectionism standard, how do we ensure that we are clearly as leaders communicating to them that 80% is as good? You also said about, I've written down here, leaders must lead by example. So if you're telling everyone that they should be spending 80% or 80% is as good as, or nearly done, or almost done, or whatever, are you doing the same? Or are you the first one in as a leader, last one out? So is there a disconnect between what you're doing and what you're saying? And how are you then kind of exemplifying that to your leaders and your teams as well? I like that term, good enough. good enough. I think honestly, I'd done more of that when I was in education, because I agree. I was one of those women in education that would want and strive for perfectionism. In the end, it was great because, of course, we got the results that we wanted, but could I have done less and probably still achieved the same outcome? Yes, I could have. And I realised that more towards the end, tail end of my career than in the very early days when you're full of energy and you're wanting to ensure that you impress and you meet every kind of benchmark, etc.
And I think it's delving into that on an individual basis as well, isn't it? So, if I notice that you, Stella, have taken so much time to do the task, then I want to have a conversation with you and unpick that with you. Is it because you didn't understand the task? Is it because you had unreasonable expectations of yourself? Or is it because you viewed my expectations of you to be different to what they actually were? And I think when you get that feedback, you can offer staff a lot of support. And there's lots of people who have perfectionism, who feel like an imposter in certain situations. And whilst we can, it's easy to say that that's an issue for them, there are lots that we can do as inclusive leaders to help that and to understand what the system is telling them about how they should behave and how they should act and what's expected of them. There's ways that we can mitigate that as leaders to help people to relax and know that they're enough and that they have a really valuable contribution to make.
Absolutely. There's a way that we can model the behaviours and the ways that we want our staff and teams to be working. And we can model that, then obviously we can get the buy-in and get individuals working in that way. And going back to our conversation around habits, once that becomes habitual, then that just naturally becomes a culture of the organisation, doesn't it? So it's that. Again, not to mention also just thinking about if people are taking a long period of time to do things, if you have cultivated those kind of relationships with your teams, then you will know that it may be that member of staff needs a reasonable adjustment, for example, or needs additional support. And again, inclusive leaders are those that are aware of the areas that staff may be finding it challenging, but who might want to do the best they can. These areas are finding challenging, and how are they themselves putting in those mechanisms to support and to help staff achieve, really. It's like, love it. Thanks, Cath. I'm going to pause there and just see if there are any questions in the chat before we begin to go to kind of final thoughts. Let's have a quick look. Cath, I've got one question here then. Cath said that leaders speaking last and listening to coach are both key, but how can we teach those skills? So the skill then to listen last, speak last and listen. That's on to you, Cath.
Yeah, I think it's about modelling it, isn't it? It's at the start of the meeting, showing that we're not going to interrupt each other, and that if you're leading that meeting, that you're going to try and ensure that people are going to get equal turns to speak. But it's also about those day-to-day interactions. So when someone grabs you in the corridor or in the staff room, are you interrupting them? Are you responding to what they've said, or are you trying to get them to think more? And I think people notice that in conversation. They notice whether you're just waiting to say something or whether you're actually listening to them. And that starts at the gate, in the staff room, in the corridors. And it's about understanding that and understanding yourself in meetings as well. Being brave enough to ask someone for feedback. How often do I interrupt people in meetings? That's always a question that sometimes hits home and hits quite hard, because none of us want to interrupt. But actually, we do it all the time. We interrupt ourselves when we pick up our phone or our email goes off. The media it stops us from thinking and interrupts that deep thought. And it's about noticing it and then doing things to mitigate it. But I think being a role model and making those expectations really clear in situations like in meetings, I think is really the two main things that will help you to foster that sense of inclusivity and to really show people that you are listening to them as people rather than waiting for your turn to give advice or to say what you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one strategy that comes to mind if I chime in here as well, Cath, thank you for that, is it's just thinking about, do you hear me or are you listening? And one way that I would say is, one thing that always comes to mind then is, are you just hearing the words that are coming out of my mouth, or are you actually listening, engaging with what I'm saying, taking them on board and then kind of carrying on from there? I think one of the strategies that I remember using or utilising in training leaders then is this idea that you would start with picking up on what the person before you has just said and then leading on from there. So what you're doing is actually showing that I am listening because I've taken on board what you said and then I've developed it and added on and gone from there essentially. And that's one mechanism in terms of just kind of showing that evolution of, have you spoken? I've heard you because I can articulate what you said. I can either respond or I can then build on that. Is that a strategy that you're familiar with?
I have heard it used and I have seen it done effectively. And I think for me, when I bring in the thinking environment, I try to make a bit of a disconnect between what someone else has just said and what you have said. Because what I want to encourage is for people to think for themselves. And often when we say that we agree with someone, we then go down a similar line of thought of extending their thinking rather than bringing our own. And that's not to say that someone else's thinking can't ignite our own thinking, but it's having that distinction that, yes, you've listened and you can reflect that point back to them. And also it's an opportunity and hopefully you feel safe enough to then say what you think as well. And I think there's a place for both of those strategies. One of the other things to mention is that I think we often make assumptions about our own ability to create a space where people can think for themselves, but you have to be really intentional about it. And so bringing in new ideas and saying that, we're not going to interrupt and really reinforcing that throughout and coming back to it. And again, like you were saying earlier, Stella, about making habits of things. So not being afraid to repeat that you want people to take equal turns, not being afraid to say, we're not going to interrupt each other, and also not bringing in shame or guilt or anything if that does happen, because we all do it. And it's about being intentional about trying not to interrupt, but also acknowledging that if that does happen, that it's normal and natural and part of the learning experience. And when we can feel ourselves listening to someone and thinking about something else, that we can just bring ourselves back, we can notice it and bring ourselves back again without any shame or feeling that we've done it wrong, but just recentering ourselves in the present and then trying to give our attention to whoever's speaking at the time.
Absolutely. Thank you. Got one more question before I let you go. Before we move to final thoughts, one of our participants has asked, what are the biggest challenges to implementing inclusive leadership practices in schools? Have these changed post-COVID? I think lots has changed post-COVID. But if I start with you, Cath, then, so what the biggest challenge is to implementing inclusive leadership practices within schools?
I think there's a few. I think in schools in particular, it's the time and the money that it can take to really build these practices in and to learning. I think in terms of inclusive practice, it's about educating ourselves. And if we don't have the knowledge and expertise within our school setting, we do need to seek that externally. And quite often that's a challenge because it then comes back that, budgets are really tight and money's already been allocated. Again, it's about leaning into those values and understanding what the priorities are. And if inclusion is a priority, then that needs to come first and then the other things need to follow. So I think that's a real challenge. I think the system and the world that we're living in presents a real challenge as well. I think there's lots of DEI initiatives that are being shut down, and there's lots of conversations systemically about how important it is and tokenism. And I think that that's a real challenge to overcome, because when you want to do better than that, and when you really see the value of celebrating diversity and bringing people in and having that representation, when the world is telling you that that's not, it's not useful, or it's not a good way to spend your money, or we don't need that, that can be a real challenge to be able to have the confidence and the courage to kind of stand up and say, no, this is our priority and we're going to lean into it and we're going to do it, even if you're telling us that it's not the most valuable thing. I think that's a real challenge. And those challenges haven't changed dramatically since COVID. But I think what has changed is the ability to connect. I think we lost a lot of connection during COVID with our communities and with staff members. And I think rebuilding that and understanding the impact of that disconnect that happened during COVID, because we didn't see each other in person, we didn't have those conversations, I think is a real challenge, and something that we still have to be really intentional about even a few years on.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that one thing that often comes up is this idea, you touched on it already then, about funding and the priorities. And we know then in education, the budgets are set well in advance. We're talking about next year's budgets currently now, aren't we? And if that's not been factored in, and as you say, that's not part of the mission, vision, and values and what we hold fast to, then actually we don't allocate the resources. And then we find that we then perhaps are responding rather than actually just having it be part of the culture. And we're just constantly responding to things that are happening on a global stage. And that's not enough. That's not good enough. It's not enough, and it's not what our young people and our teams deserve at all, is it? Yeah, absolutely. Right. Before I let you go, let's go to final thoughts then, Cath. If I were to say, what would be the one quality every school leader should be adopting? Just one.
To listen, to ignite thinking. I think it's a game changer.
Listen to ignite thinking.
Yeah.
Listen to ignite thinking. Don't write that one down. Okay. And lastly then, what we do know is that despite the challenges being faced by many in education, you know the recent report then that talks about the disparities in global majority or ethnic minority, depending on how you use, global majority staff making their way into education, from ITT, progressing through, getting into leadership and so on and so forth. We know those challenges with regards to the pipelines there. If there are any, and of course then there are lots of others, if there's any advice you could give to an aspiring leader currently that is really passionate about this work, really keen to see inclusive leadership at the core of how they go on to lead their departments or lead their teams or their schools even, what would you say to an aspiring leader in terms of something different from sort of, listening, yes, but aspiring leaders in this case? So I know there's a few of them that had reached out and wanted to kind of know, what do I do? How do I enter the space? What would you say to them?
I would say start with your mindset and your working on yourself first, because I think that reflecting on all of the experiences that got you to this point and understanding where you want to go and how you want to do that, being aware of what your triggers are, what your challenges are, what your strengths are, what your values are, can really be something to lean into when it gets tough. And it can get tough and you can feel like you're banging on a closed door. But if you can lean into all of those things to give you the motivation and the mindset to keep going, and to know that even if that door is closed, that there's another door that can open for you, and that you do really have value to share in the world, and that you taking that next step and increasing that representation really does make a difference to the people looking around the room in assemblies or walking down the corridors. And so knowing that it starts with you first, and that's what you're in control of, is a really important first step for me.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much, Cath, for your insights. I would ask anyone that's interested in continuing these conversations to please reach out to us here at IDC. You've been Cath, I've been Stella, and reach out to us, engage with the content that we're putting out there. If you are keen to do this work within your schools, then we have an education offer teaser document that can be found on our website. The link will be posted in the chat. Click on it, get in contact, and keep following us and following the dialogue around inclusive leadership. Look out for upcoming events. But Cath, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Stella. Thanks, everyone.